We're back, and we're going to continue this really important conversation with one of the folks who I turn to for insight and analysis on homeland security matters, great and more local. And Kyle, one of the things you've been focusing on, again, our guest is Kyle Shideler of the Center for Security Policy. One of the things you've been focusing on, Kyle, is the effort that is being made by the left to, well, take over, I guess is the word for it, local law enforcement. This episode seems to be something that is spurring a lot of efforts on gun control. That's a hardy perennial in these incidents, of course, but also a broader agenda. And I want you to talk about both, if you would. Maybe first, the gun control piece and the advisability of these various proposed remedies, whether it's banning certain classes of weapons or whether it's red flag laws being imposed, or whether it's sort of raising the whole mental health focus of effort. And then we'll talk a little bit about the broader issue of defunding the police and otherwise trying to control them.
Sure. Well, I don't think we can ignore the irony of, on the one hand, pointing out that the only solution to this problem when you have an incident like an active shooter is for the first available person on the scene with a firearm to engage them to the death, if need be. And on the other hand, want to disarm everybody. It simply doesn't make any sense. If you look at FBI statistics on active shooters, they clearly indicate that the vast majority of active shootings are stopped by force, either by the arrival of law enforcement or by a civilian on the scene who is armed with some kind of weapon. So there are a couple of incidences of large numbers of civilians getting together to overwhelm one of these attackers, but the vast majority of them are done by civilians carrying firearms in their regular everyday life. Now, obviously, this was a school. There are specific federal laws around that. But the reality is that every time we have one of these incidents, on the one hand, we're being told that somebody with a firearm should have been there faster. And on the other hand, people shouldn't have firearms. And that, to me, seems to really point out the insanity of the left's position on these things.
It does. So we're watching, nonetheless, this concerted effort to grab guns or otherwise impinge upon the Second Amendment freedoms. The First Amendment are under assault in other contexts, of course, but the Second Amendment freedoms of Americans who are law-abiding and entitled to that unalienable right to bear arms. That's very much an agenda of the left, of course. But talk about this effort to, it used to be called defund the police. What are they calling it now? Or what form is this effort taking to sort of exercise dominion, shall we say, over our law enforcement personnel at the local level?
Well, the left's attacks on local policing in this country continue to take a wide variety of forms. You have efforts to defund police. In some cases, you have efforts to abolish police and replace them with social workers. That would not have worked out very well in the Uvalde school shooting case for obvious reasons. And most concerning to me is the move by congressional and Senate Democrats to treat local law enforcement officers like domestic extremists and like terrorists. Just immediately after the shooting in Texas, the Senate Democrats tried to move forward on their preferred domestic terrorism bill, which, in addition to labeling large swaths of the American public as white supremacists, they also single out local law enforcement for being treated as extremists, demanding that they be vetted, demanding that the federal government institute controls over the kinds of training they get when it comes to terrorism, no doubt trying to focus them on the things of issue that the federal government wants to focus on, which is white supremacy, and not on the issues that maybe matter most important to the local officers in question. And it's a major push, and to devalue and um, penalize police, but also it's a major push to force local police to exercise the priorities of the federal government. And that's not the law enforcement process that we have in this country. We have a local law enforcement based in this country. That is the first responder in an incident. Those are the people that you look to protect you. And only later do we turn to the federal government when it comes to investigating some of these bigger ticket crimes, white collar crimes, things like that. And this is the federal government and the DOJ trying to stick their tentacles as far down into local policing as they can to control what local law enforcement officers learn about terrorism and extremism and how they deal with it, and which treats local law enforcement officers like criminals and like terrorists.
And Kyle, this is one of the things I think I'm most proud of in terms of the program that you run at the Center for Security Policy is the efforts to provide these state and local law enforcement and other authorities with training that they're not getting any longer from the federal authorities, their federal counterparts. And I must say, especially as we learn more about what is being done by the Biden administration to really weaponize the Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Information, and for that matter, I guess the military and the intelligence community as well, against this putative domestic terrorist threat, the violent extremists, the white supremacists, whatever term they choose for the moment. It really does come down to a yawning void in terms of the kind of training that these folks actually need to have, especially at a moment, Kyle, and this is another of your priorities, I know, especially at a moment when we are importing huge numbers of military age unaccompanied young men in the form of illegal aliens into this country and disseminating them all over our land. It's a formula, it seems to me, for a real security problem, homeland, national for that matter, security problem, and making, again, all the more urgent efforts to shore up, enhance the training and the readiness and the morale, not least, of those state and local, law enforcement folks who are going to wind up probably having to fill the void. No?
No, that's exactly right. I mean, I think if you look at our track record when it comes to counterterrorism, uh, the number of times when it has been a local law enforcement officer who ends up doing what needs to be done, as in the example of the Garland, Texas shooting, where Robert Spencer and Pamela Geller and their guests were targeted for assassination by two members of ISIS. It was a local law enforcement officer who put those two bad guys down. They were actually being followed by an FBI agent
Yes.
who had told them while he was surveilling them that they should tear up Texas.
Right.
This is, and
What's
we
wrong with
talk
that picture?
right.
And that wasn't even the Biden administration. That was some years ago, no?
That was some years ago, and we continue to hear this example of what we call known wolves,
Mm-hmm.
where federal law enforcement follows bad guys right up to right up to the moment of acting. They knew that the guy was a bad guy. They didn't do anything about it, and so and the federal government isn't doing its job when it comes to counterterrorism. So
Right.
that space has to be filled by local law enforcement who aren't getting the information that they need because the federal government doesn't want to give it to them. We
Right.
hear this from local cops all the time when we go to train them. They'll say, we're sick of hearing this white supremacist stuff. We don't have that problem in my area of operation. I need to know about jihadist threats. I need to know about anarchist and Antifa organizations and threats. I don't know anything about that. And there's nobody for me to ask.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
but there is somebody for them to ask, and that's Kyle Shideler and our team at the Center for Security Policy. You can find out much more about it at securefreedom.org, folks. And I hope you'll look to it as a resource, not only for yourselves and to find out what you can do to try to assure your personal security, that of your family, that of your community, but also to help those who are responsible for performing that for all of your community to know where they can turn for the kind of information that Kyle Shideler is providing. Kyle, let me just close by quickly asking you about that lone wolf thing. The individual who perpetrated this crime in Uvalde was someone who had, in fact, been up on the radar scope of the law enforcement community. He's not the only one, even if they weren't tracking him to the moment in which he acted in this horrible way. He was a guy that they should have had eyes on and been monitoring. Am I right? And where's the breakdown there?
Undoubtedly. I think there's the breakdown is in a couple of places. One, in communications and getting information about bad guys to people who actually are empowered to do something about it. Secondly, actually empowering them to do something. And then third, also in education. There is very little training for law enforcement, local, state, and federal, about the ideology and nature of some of these threats. Now, in the case of this school shooting, the individual appears to have been mentally ill or had other issues that were not ideological in nature. But what we see on the terrorism side of the house is that law enforcement doesn't have the training to recognize some of the indicators of what they're seeing when they interview some of these guys, when they talk to some of these guys. They don't know what questions to ask, and they don't know how to interpret the answers that they're given.
And they need
They're
help in
not
all
trained.
those regards, and they can get it from Kyle Shideler at the Center for Security Policy. Bless you, my friend. Keep up the great work you do. Come back to us with updates on all of this if you would. Ward Connerly joins us next. We'll talk with him about critical race theory and more right after this.